Welcome everyone to Ontology Summit 2020 Fall Series. So today today is November 20th, 2019, and I am pleased to say that we are going to be continuing this very interesting series of meetings now on metaphor. And so at this point, I would like to turn the meeting over to Professor Elise Stickles, who is going to hopefully answer some more questions and continue the discussion about metaphor. So Elise, could you?
Sure. I'm in the chat and I don't see any questions in there yet. So are there any questions people have from the floor?
Yeah, I have a question. Is there any, or do you have any notion of how metaphors evolve? How do they come into being?
Mm-hmm. Oh. So there's kind of two tracks or ways of answering this question. So one is if you look at primary metaphors, those, I think we talked about this a little bit last week, the idea that primary or basic level metaphors derive from physiological experience. So those are based on physical experiences that we have, such as experiencing heat in our bodies while we're feeling angry, and therefore we develop metaphors like anger is heat. Right, so you could be boiling with rage. So that's one track of explanations, is basically the physiological one. The more interesting question, I think, for me these days is, how do we develop metaphors that are really culturally specific? And so a really interesting triad is if you look at metaphors in English for playing games, for war and politics, and also for foot races typically, which is the type of game that's most common, so sports. They all use metaphors of each other. So to explain this, you can think of politics as war, politics as a race, but you can also think of a sporting game or event as a war, and you can think of war as a game. So why is it that all of these things are both the source and the target in this sense? So, either you can have politics as war, or war is politics. You can have politics as a game. You can have a game is war is a game, right? It's like it works both ways. So why is that? And it seems to be that those derive from structural similarities in the frames rather than physical experiences per se. So these are, culturally informed frames that, not every culture has the same notion of politics, not every culture has the same notion of war, not every culture has the same notion of what constitutes a sport or a game. But for, at least in English, we have this understanding that games have winners and losers. And in politics, there are winners and losers. And in war, there's winners and losers. And so that ability to recognize this shared frame rule structure between all three of them means that the metaphor is kind of enabled, right? So a shared frame structure is really what permits the mapping of one frame onto another in the metaphor. Excuse me. And in this particular case, that mapping is so conceptually available that it works both ways, meaning that we can also map the inferential structure, which I spent a lot of time talking about last week, both ways as well. So if you think about war as a game, not only do you have winners and losers, which you can just get from the war frame, but the idea that there are rules that those map on as well. So the rules of war map onto the rules of the game. The idea that there is strategizing maps on as well. So both war and sports have strategies. There's moves you can make, moves you can plan ahead, moves you can parry, right? Counter attacks and so forth. So all of that structure is shared between the two frames. And that allows us to think about war as a game just as easily as we can think about games as war, right? And then we see linguistic evidence in the form of, if you think about how people talk about sports, right? You beat the competition. They're not physically, usually they're not physically harming each other intentionally, unless you're talking about like a hockey fight or that guy who smashed the other guy with his helmet. Usually it's metaphorically beating. And in the war side of things, we can talk about war games, right? And taking, playing with your opponent or whatever. So we can talk about war using the language of games. We can talk about games using language of war. And that's an example of a culturally mediated metaphor, which draws on our culture's understanding of these frames and the frame structure that maps between them. So John is just saying in the chat that metaphor is the normal way of extending vocabulary to new areas. So if you're talking about semantic change, there's lots of ways in which words can gain new meanings over time. And metaphor and metonymy, so figurative language, are very common ways of doing that. So we talked about grasp last week. So if you have understanding something as grasping, so hold that thought, or I can't wrap my mind around that concept. The word grasp itself right now means to understand. So that originally didn't mean to understand, it just mean to physically hold. And then there was because this metaphor developed in English, we gained the ability to use the word grasp metaphorically, and now grasp means both to physically hold and to mentally hold. John also brings up dead metaphors. Dead metaphors, some people argue that there's no such thing as a dead metaphor. There's a great book, I believe by Cornelia Miller, called something like Not Dead But Sleeping, where she argues that we still have access to the conceptual structure of so-called dead metaphors, and therefore they're not really dead. We just don't have really active access to them linguistically, but we still have access to them conceptually.
Yes, one example, in fact, the words high and low are always metaphors. And so when we're talking about a top-level ontology, that applies to the fact that we draw the trees with the most general node at the top. And the same thing is true for a thermometer. The little red or silvery thing goes up and down, and that's why we talk about high temperatures versus low temperatures. So these words high and low are just so fundamental to everything we talk about that people don't even think of them as metaphors, but really they are indeed up and low. Or another example is just you talk about something in the offing. And does anybody know where the term in the offing comes from? Well, guess what? It comes from sailing, because when a sailing ship was coming into port, when you first saw it as the masts rose above the level of the sea, it was in the offing. That was the offing, was the part where the sea sort of disappears. And so in the offing means that the ship is coming in, and pretty soon it will be landing at the port. And so that's all these terms we don't even think about in the offing as a sailing metaphor, but they're there all the time. And nowadays people talk about all the time people using the computer metaphors, and they're saying the refrigerator is down because the software went down. Well, down is another metaphor for software, and then they apply that same metaphor to refrigerators and or things that you normally never used the terms before. But the same thing is the technology of the 17th, 18th century is really solidly engrounded in a modern language. Like when people talk about by and large, well, that applies to this to the sails on a ship. And there's just a huge amount of sailing metaphors that have become quote dead or sleeping metaphors in ordinary language.
These are fantastic examples. So I'd like to talk first a little bit about the high and low examples, right? Because those are good examples of the first kind of metaphor I was talking about, where in MetaNet, we would treat these as metaphoric because we have a clear understanding of what the source and target domain is, and the basis of the metaphoric reasoning structure. So high and low, or up and down being, these scalar phenomena that we experience in the real world, right? I think either last time or 2 weeks ago, I was talking about how as a small child you stack blocks on top of other blocks and you get more of them, and therefore you develop this very natural understanding of more is up. Or if you pour water into a glass and the level of the water raises, if you pour water out of the glass, the level of the water lowers, you have more water or less water, so you get more is up and less is down. So the physiological underpinnings of more is up, less is down, higher is increasing, lower is decreasing. That appears to be a kind of cognitive universal because it's a physical universal. So in MetaNet, we would definitely still treat all of the usages you gave of high and low as metaphoric, because we have this very clear, elaborated metaphor structure that those plug into. In contrast, if you talk about these fantastic sailing metaphors, which I am personally completely unfamiliar with, those are really good example of culturally mediated metaphors, right? So when in the 17th and 18th century, sailing was more culturally relevant than it is today, it makes sense that we would have all of these metaphors making use of a very culturally salient domain, sailing and ships and so forth. And then now today, those of us who are unfamiliar with sailing wouldn't know what offing is. And therefore, for us, it would be, yes, effectively a dead metaphor. But presumably, there's still sailors in the world who know what those words are. And therefore, for them, it would be an active metaphor. So that's a very nice example of the fact that metaphors are not only culturally mediated, but they are reflective of one's personal expertise and experience, which is true of frames in general, right? So we all have our own kind of personal frame structure, which is the result of our own personal experiences, background, what we're familiar with, where we grew up, whatever. And so everyone's frames are a tiny bit different, but most of our cultural frames we share with other people within our culture. However, if you're a sailor and I'm not, you're going to have sailing frames that I don't. Just as if I'm a linguist and you're not, I'm going to have more elaborated linguistics frames than you do. So the result of this personal variation or individual variation in frame structure is individual variation in metaphor structure. So obviously, if you're the only person on Earth who understands sailing, then you really can't use these metaphors because they won't make sense to anyone but you. But presumably, if you have other sailor buddies you could talk to, and you use words like offing, that will activate the metaphor structure for them as well. I also wanted to comment on, oh gosh, what was the last thing that came up, right? The computer metaphors. So that was really interesting, right? Because if you look at metaphors for the mind, that we've used over time, so going back to the question of where metaphors evolve from or where they come from, the way we talk about cognition is very culturally bound. So if you look at a history of the way we talked about how the mind works, when clocks were the most kind of advanced technology, we talked about the mind as being a clock and, clockwork and having gears and mechanisms and so forth. And now, because technology has advanced so that we have computers, we are far more likely to talk about the mind as a computer. And what's really interesting is, as technology changes, so too does our understanding of the mind. And if you look at, psychology writing, the way we reason about the mind actually changes, with a reflection of the metaphors that the author is using. So I'm looking forward to finding out the way we're going to talk about the mind in 50 years or whatever, presumably as we've developed more advanced technologies. Maybe once we have quantum computing, then we're going to start talking about the mind more as, having multiple possible states or something at the same time to reflect the metaphor structure of quantum computing, right? Anyway, so I thought that was just a nice example of how metaphors change in response to changing culture. And then the refrigerator is down thing is fantastic because, to just say that your computer is down or your software is down, that's plugging into a very common metaphor, which is alive is up and dead is down, right? So if you're alive, you are standing up, and if you're dead, well, you're lying down, right? So that's a kind of basic physiological experience that we can observe. Can't really experience it ourselves, because once we do, we can't use metaphors anymore. But it's something we can observe throughout our lives. And so we have a very basic metaphor: living is up, dead is down. And then if you think about computers as organisms, then you can say that the computer is alive or the computer is dead, or the system is up, the server is up, the server is down. So you're thinking of the server as a living being. And therefore, if it's a living being, if it's alive, it's up, and if it's dead, it's down. And then, so we first developed that network of metaphors for the technology of computers because we tend to think more of computers as people. We're less likely to think of refrigerators as people, right? Because they don't display the hallmarks of sentience that computers tend to. We tend to treat computers like people because they seem to talk to us, and we can talk to them, and we can argue with them, and they're kind of more sentient in a sense than refrigerators are. So this is a great example of the metaphor was originally developed based on the frame structure of computers, right? So we think of computers as people, and therefore computers can be alive, computers can be dead. If computers can be alive and dead, then we can use up and down to refer to them. This was then extended to refrigerators. So we don't think of refrigerators as alive as people. So we can't directly extend the metaphor up and down because we don't have access to the refrigerators or people metaphor. We don't have that structure in place. So instead of this being a direct metaphor extension, what we have is a metonymy extension. So refrigerators and computers are both technology, so they have they're semantically related to each other. So if we can talk about computers as up and down, then we must be able to talk about refrigerators as up and down because they have the shared frame structure or shared semantics of both being types of technology. That's a really, really fun example. That's the kind of thing that I would assign to my students as a kind of a hard essay question because there's a whole lot going on there.
Yeah, another thing is the word metonymy. That's another way of extending the vocabulary, and
Exactly,
that's where
yes.
you refer to something by something else that is close to it. For example, when you talk about the White House announced today, whatever, that is referring to a place where those notices come from. And sometimes it's often used as to talk about the White House because information might come from the president, or it can come from any official at the White House, and it's not clear who exactly said it. So you just say the White House announced today that blah, blah, blah. And the same thing you can talk about any sort of thing that's the location, like you can talk about the Supreme Court and the building of you can talk about the building or about the people. So for example, well, actually for the Supreme Court, the name is the building is called that, but you can talk about the Capitol. That's another building where if you don't want to distinguish whether it's the House or the Senate, you can just talk about the Capitol and about the activities going on there.
Yeah, so metaphor and metonymy both are processes of mapping information from one frame to another, or in the case of metonymy can also be within a frame. The difference is that metaphor is mapping between two semantically unrelated frames, and metonymy is a relationship between semantically related frames. So the Supreme, or not the Supreme Court, the Capitol building or example is a good one because the building is directly related to the people who are in it, right? So they're semantically related. Or if you use the author for work example, where you say, have you read Shakespeare? The author, Shakespeare, is semantically related to his, plays and poems and so forth. So you have a metonymic relationship between author and work, which is a semantically related relationship, in contrast to metaphor, where the relation is between, or the mapping is between two semantically distant or unrelated concepts.
Janet had a comment.
Yeah, hi. I realized that what we've been talking about here with metaphor is very important for answering some of the questions we've been dealing with since this topic was, the knowledge graphs topic was proposed, that people have been saying, but knowledge graphs aren't really anything new. We had this before in this form or that form, or we can represent anything in a table that we can represent in a graph, or we had it in networks, semantic networks. But it's the metaphor, it's the graph metaphor that, especially the knowledge graph metaphor, I think, that is what has captured, that hit the sweet spot. It's a better root metaphor than talking about tables. So on the data side, if you talk about, property graphs or things like that, that's more accessible than relational tables. And, it seems like it's accessible throughout, from user end, that they can see things in a graph quickly. Anyway, so I realized that what you were talking about folded back and answered why we've had the feeling that nothing has really changed, and yet things have really changed. I don't know if you have any insight on that, or if you have just prompted that recognition. Once maybe people have a technology, or they have something available, and until they get a good metaphor for understanding, for grasping what is going on there, it doesn't really take off. Maybe, I don't know if you have examples of that.
I don't think I have an example of that per se, but I feel like that this does kind of open up for me one of the things I wanted to do today, which is actually turn the tables a little bit and learn more about why why metaphor was one of your main topics for your summit this year, and what drives the kind of new interest in metaphor, because as a linguist, I'm like, well, of course metaphor is interesting inherently, but on the computational side of things, if you look at the literature, there has been an explosion of interest in computational approaches to metaphor. So I'm very curious as to why there's this kind of sudden coalescence of different communities all being interested in looking at metaphor from different angles at the same time. And where your group kind of fits into that.
I do have one example of a technology maybe to answer the question that I raised, which was the horseless carriage idea was awkward. The automobile, that it moves itself, then opened up new ways of thinking about things. So, maybe that's where we are in the semantic technology, that the graphs have just become a really appealing root metaphor, and of course in the machine language, it's neither graphs nor tables. So that's a framing that we're using to organize our understanding. I don't really know why Ken brought you into this, because it was just sort of fortuitous that that he did that. Maybe Ken can answer it.
Metaphor was one of the topics that we discussed as part of the summit from the start. So this is not just a chance thing.
Right, but it was sort of an alternative. We were considering focusing on metaphor, and then we decided to focus on knowledge graphs, and now I think we've had a good marriage between the two. Hopefully we can continue developing that.
The piece, this is Mark, and this is just one of the threads, Elise, but our last summit touched on explainability challenges, and I don't know how thoroughly we covered it, but we tackled it anyway. And one of the things you encounter in that space is that for things like the challenge I put into the chat in IEEE standard on transparency, you need to be able to explain technical things to less technical people. I won't call them non-technical, but less technical. And it's unavoidable to try to use analogical and metaphorical natural language in order to explain things to non-technical people. In fact, that may be the only common ground in many scenarios. So you see that a lot in medicine. You see it a lot in explaining things like the latest thing in computing is containers, which is totally metaphorical. There's no physical
there's no actual containment there.
Yeah. So, and you can even argue, well, that's not even a very good metaphor. So there's a lot of kind of sloppy thinking about how the crosswalk needs to be done from an ontology point of view. But I think it's one of the areas of interest. I don't know how where we go with it, but it's sort of one of the threads that led to this question.
It's kind of reminds me of kind of tangentially. There is also the issue that the metaphor you can use to explain something to someone can in fact hold back their reasoning or understanding. So, related to the technology examples we've been talking about, the notion of the computer desktop was originally developed for basically, less technical people to understand the file structure of their computer without having to think about how it's actually, represented in there underlyingly. So they introduced the term desktop, and originally, your computer screen was arranged like your physical desk would be, right? Of course, you don't normally keep your trash can on your desk, but there was still the idea that you had your writing implement, your word processor, and your trash can, and your other tools where it all be laid out in front of you at your desk. And that worked really well for a long time, but now we still have the term desktop, and it's effectively not only is it no longer necessary, but attempts to move away from it are kind of met with resistance. So like when Microsoft tried to get rid of their desktop in Windows, they had to basically introduce the alternative classic desktop because people were so used to it, even though the whole point of getting rid of the desktop was that it was no longer a necessary visual representation, and in fact was kind of limiting the user's relationship with their computer. They weren't making full use of it because they were limiting themselves to only stuff that was accessible via the desktop. So in that case, you had a metaphor that was actually limiting the user's experience because, if you're thinking about your computer as the physical space in front of you, you only have access to the physical space in front of you in the real world, not the stuff that is, hidden beneath it, so to speak. So they tried to get rid of the desktop, and it didn't work out very well for them because people were so used to it.
Wow, there's that example, but of course the one that I deal with every day is the distinction that emerged later on, I guess, between desktops and servers. And so in the infrastructure space, it has a very specialized meaning for people who manage computers. That is a very important distinction that's tied to people's roles in the enterprise.
I think the conversation going on in the chat about trees having their roots at the top or the bottom is really interesting, because this is another example of metaphoric structure that can actually lead to confusion, because I've had this experience myself. Right, so if you think about the phrases high level and low level, right? If you are thinking about abstract is at the top, concrete is at the bottom, then something that is low level, in that case, you effectively have the root at the bottom and the leaves at the top, metaphorically speaking, where the leaves are the most specific things in the tree and the roots are the most general thing in the tree, the root being the base, right? So low level is general, high level is specific. But if you're a computer scientist, then you want to think about the root at the top and the branches at the bottom. And so high level, the phrase high level in that case would refer to the root. And therefore you have this kind of metaphoric mismatch, right? You don't want to say the root is high level. But unless you kind of specify in conversation which metaphor you're using, are the roots at the top or the bottom of your tree, then phrases like high level and low level can mean the exact opposite things, right?
And
I have actually had this problem in when we were designing MetaNet. People would use phrases like high level and low level, and we wouldn't know whether they were thinking metaphorically with the roots at the top or the bottom.
Yeah, one interesting example related to trees is the word stump. And in French, the word souche, S-O-U-C-H-E, refers to the lowest part of a tree, which could be translated as stump in some cases. On the other hand, the French use the word souche to refer to the lowest part of the tree even when it's alive. And so there's a problem. They were talking about the souche of the Indo-European languages. And if you translate souche as stump, it comes out as the stump of the Indo-European languages, which implies that they're dead, that they were cut off. But the point is that in French, you want to say that the souche is the source. It's where all of the languages come from. Whereas if you translate souche as stump, you get the image of a tree that has dead, and all the branches have been carted away. And that's another example where metaphors in one language don't carry over to another language, even though the two languages are used in practically the same culture and they have evolved in parallel for centuries. The fact is that there are some words that really don't translate because they happen to be based on different metaphors.
Right. So I would say actually the metaphor itself translates, because we do conceptualize, language is trees the same way that we do in French, right? It's just that the exact translation of stump is the problem, right?
Right.
So this is actually, this is a real common problem that we have in translation is, and actually one of the reasons for why MetaNet exists is the translation problem, right? So it's not just a matter of getting the word translation correct, which machine translation is pretty good at for some languages these days, but getting the metaphor translation correct as well is a much harder problem because it requires natural language understanding, not just machine, statistically based, pattern matching essentially. So in that case, using the word stump would not be an accurate metaphoric translation. It might be an accurate lexical translation, but of course we would not want to translate it as stump. We want to translate it as root, right? So recognizing that the semantic extension of the French term refers to the whole bottom part of the tree, not just the dead, and does not include the cut off interpretation that stump does, would result in a more accurate translation that would correctly reflect the metaphoric meaning in the original French.
See, Ravi has his hand up.
Oh, yeah.
Ravi, do you have audio? I'm actually not sure.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Okay. Good. I have two questions on the chat board, which I want to begin, but I want to put a little twist and say that in Sanskrit there are concepts, among which one of them is that human beings are having root at the top and the limbs and the leaves at the periphery below. Like our brain is the root and the rest is all like tree upside down. So that's one concept I wanted to bring, but it's not only true of humans, but anything that's walking erect, I guess. You can extend it to that. But in rest of the biology, botany, for example, it's usually the other way around. Anyway, that's just a part. My question is that understanding language itself is a difficult task. Then extracting metaphors in the use of that language is even harder task. And then I want to, as a non-English person, natively, understand what's the difference between similes, idioms, and metaphors.
So I can address the last part. I love your Sanskrit example. That's fantastic. It makes a lot of sense. Like even though I don't have that metaphor in English, the reasoning is quite clear. Right. So a simile is the only difference between a simile and a metaphor is its linguistic realization. Right. So that's the difference between saying ideas are objects and ideas are like objects. So with a simile, you just add the comparative like, and with the metaphor, you just don't have like, right? You just say it directly, ideas are objects. So that's a linguistic difference that for me as a cognitive linguist is not interesting at all. I'm sure there are some folks who are interested in the distribution and frequency of simile versus metaphor and that kind of thing. But because we're interested primarily in the underlying conceptual structure that is activated by the language, we don't see a real difference between those two constructions. It's a syntactic difference, not a semantic difference. Conceptually, they're the same. So that's simile versus metaphor.
Idioms?
Idiom,
what about idioms?
Yeah. So idiom is a blanket term for idiosyntactic constructions or sayings in that are language specific, which may be metaphoric in nature. They may not be. It's basically a type of figurative language in which direct translation is impossible because you just have to know what that entire phrase means. So a great example in English is kick the bucket. So that means to die, right? So if you say kick the bucket, you mean he died. No one actually knows where this came from. And if you look it up online, there are plenty of ridiculous stories that people have come up with, folk etymologies that explain where kick the bucket came from.
Grass is greener on the other side. Is it a metaphor?
So grass is greener, right? So that's a slightly more transparent idiom in the sense that, you can kind of reason through it. We actually think there might be a physiological basis to the grass is greener. But in that case, yeah, that would be more of a metaphor, because you are thinking about, places or states of being as places, right? So the place on my side of the fence versus the place on your side of the fence. And we're understanding those places as being metaphors for, life, or the state of existence, right? So the state of being on my side of the fence isn't as good as the state of being on your side of the fence. So yes, that would be an example of an idiom that is grounded in more basic metaphoric structure. So some idioms are metaphoric, others are completely like obscure in their origin.
So in
like
any machine language learning using NLP, even understanding all grammar rules or some kind of context little bit, still it is very hard to tackle metaphors in using computers. Is it my correct impression or not?
Absolutely, yeah. So in a sense, idioms are a bit easier than general metaphor, because idioms by their nature have a specific word structure and syntax, right? So I have to say kick the bucket. I can't say kick the can, or kick the container, or kick the Tupperware, right? It has to, and I can't say trip the bucket, or hit the bucket, right? It has to be kick the bucket, right? Those three words. And any other word means that it's no longer that idiom. So for that reason, you can hard code the translation of idioms, right? In the chat right now, we have hard coding is too easy, right? So in this case, you could just have a rule in your translation software that, if you run into the phrase kick the bucket, you can just treat that as a synonym of dead, right? And then you would just need to develop a list of common idioms in English, their direct translations, and then you'd be done. And you wouldn't need to do any kind of extensive pattern matching or machine learning. You just have a set of rules for idioms. In contrast, metaphor by nature is not a set of predefined, or it's not a closed set of words or phrases in any sense of the term. And so you can't hard code metaphor. You have to be able to recognize it, at the statistical level, in effect. And that is a much harder problem.
And what about analogy versus metaphor?
Analogy. So analogy is effectively explicating the underlying reasoning process of the metaphor. So analogies are making use of the same conceptual structure as metaphors. Again, they're effectively just a different linguistic realization of the same conceptual structure.
Yeah, in other words, you can say that the analogy is the basic process of structure mapping. So you have a structural a structure such as your tree that you have in your diagram, and then you're mapping the structure of the diagram to the structure of an actual plant. And an analogy is also a general term for structure mapping. And so structure mapping is the basis for the metaphor, because that maps, in effect, one frame or knowledge representation of whatever kind to the other representation.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyone else? Ram, you're online. I haven't heard from you for a while. You still there?
I'm under mute, just listening. And actually, I had a similar question to which was answered in terms of analogy and metaphors. So, because we kind of used to work a lot on case-based reasoning, where you have things like the atom is like the solar system. So, and then people kind of somehow deduce the structure of the atom from the structure of the solar system. The sort of analogy or case-based reasoning, and metaphors seems to be very similar to me. And I think the LCS provided an answer for that in terms of they're kind of similar, but in terms of the semantic differences there, in terms of the you use the analogical processing on the metaphors. I don't know whether I'm parsing this right or not, Elsie.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, that's a good example because there's a case where the structure is is based on some kind of a metaphor. So in the early days of when people had originally discovered the electrons and protons, and the question was, how are they related in a molecule and or an atom? And so one competing so there were two competing theories. One was the plum pudding model, and the other was
right.
the model of the orbits around a planet, planetary orbits. And the plum pudding idea was that the positive charge of whatever was there was sort of the pudding, and the electrons were like little plums stuck in the pudding. And then it was Niels Bohr who, and the idea of the orbital thing was actually very early in the 19th century, but the point is that there were some issues about electromagnetic radiation, that if you had an electron orbiting around a positive charge, it would the orbit would collapse because there would be radiation caused by the by that orbiting. And so it was Niels Bohr that applied the idea of quantization and said, well, the point is that you cannot do the radiation except in discrete photons, and that is why you can have stable orbits, because you cannot go from one orbit to another except by emitting a discrete photon. And so there's all those ideas of particles and waves. Those are, again, metaphors, because when you talk about electronic fields and waves, those are metaphors based on what you see when you look at the ocean or a river. And again, all throughout science, you have metaphors upon metaphors upon metaphors. And when you come to think of it, yeah, look, you talk about quantum waves versus quantized particles. Those are all metaphors. And science is just filled with metaphors. It's the whole terminology of everything is just based on metaphors.
There's some fantastic work being done on the metaphors that scientists use to explain science, and the degree to which the different kinds of metaphors that are being used are more or less effective in conveying the correct inferential structures and processes that are supposed to be explained. You know, the solar system model of the atom is actually a great example, because I remember from my own chemistry class in high school, you know, the first you learn the solar system model, right? So you have the nucleus and then the electrons orbiting around it, and that seems to make sense. But then you learn that it's actually, you know, the orbitals are more like, you know, probability fields, and you have to completely reconceptualize your understanding of you know, how the structure of the atom actually works. And I had a really hard time jumping from one conceptualization to the other, because I was so metaphorically bound to the solar system conception. And then, of course, when you start trying to think about particles versus waves, then it just gets really confusing. So the plum pudding and the solar system are great examples of, you know, the technology of the time being used as the metaphoric basis for reasoning about you know, scientific phenomenon that we don't have access to visually.
Yeah, and there are constantly inventing new metaphors, like the Big Bang at the beginning of the what we know of the universe, or the black holes, which are things into which matter and energy can fall, and but no light can ever come out. And it's just filled with metaphors. All of science, you're using metaphors all around.
Dark matter, dark energy, there are millions of things where metaphors are used. Actually, the whole understanding of our unified fields is metaphorical.
And also string theory is another one. You know, all of these are metaphors.
God, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I can talk about this a lot more.
Very well today.
There's a really lovely paper by Rafael Nunez looking at the gestures that I believe physicists make in teaching physics classes, because you know, gesture is metaphoric as well. And you know, how do you gesture a particle versus a wave, and the extent to which the gestures are representing the kind of accurately representing the metaphoric mappings that they're trying to explain in their class. Anyway, I wanted to answer Mark's question. I don't believe so. I don't think there is any academic work connecting MetaNet to domain-specific language design. No.
Thank you, John. Thank you. John is leaving us.
Oh yeah, it is well, 10 o'clock for me. So we should probably wrap up, Ken?
The end of the hour. So I want to thank everyone for
Ram is leaving, yeah.
For,
so everybody, thank you. I'm sorry I joined late today.
Yeah, so and the so I'll be posting all of the recording. In fact, let me stop it now.